Good morning. I'm Don Briel from the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota, and I'm very pleased to chair this session on the question of formation and renewal in the university. Particularly pleased because we have a really fine panel to engage this question, all of them from Baylor University. And Baylor, one has to say in our own moment, is creating some wonderful new opportunities to define and to renew the Christian university in the United States. There will be a session tomorrow in which this question will be addressed more directly, but I have to say that it's a very impressive program which is underway now at Baylor University and a sign of hope for Christian higher education in general. I'll introduce each of the three panelists, introduce them all in the beginning in the order in which they will speak, and then at the conclusion of their remarks we'll have an opportunity for some question and answer. The first speaker today is Doug Henry, who is the acting director of the Baylor Institute for Faith and Learning. He completed his doctoral studies in philosophy at Vanderbilt. He'll be followed by Michael Beaty, the vice provost for faculty development at Baylor. Michael completed his doctoral studies in philosophy here at Notre Dame. And then the final speaker this morning will be Scott Moore, the director of the Great Text Program at Baylor University. And Scott received his PhD at Baylor and did postdoctoral study here at Notre Dame. So the first speaker today is Doug Henry.
Very grateful for the opportunity to reflect with you about the nature of moral formation within the context of the university, and appreciative for Don's kind words. We want to pursue a conversation exploring the way things used to be educationally, why they came to be as they presently are, and how they might be changed. And my task in this paper, Teaching Virtue, Schooling Minds, Culture of Formation, and a History of the University, is to engage in the first task, to talk about the way we were. Before doing so, I want to say just a few words, however, about the point of this task, and in doing so I want to reflect on the morally laden character of memory. To remember or to learn the past does not come automatically or inevitably for humans. What I mean, to adapt Aristotle, is that we are historically discerning neither by nature nor against nature. Rather, we are by nature able to acquire it. The point is this: to remember or to learn how one's forebears conducted life comes about in any way worth valuing because of disciplined practices that self-consciously value one's tradition. Human beings simply do not adopt the practices upon which historical consciousness depends without deliberateness, without discipline, and this certainly, it seems, is a lesson that St. Augustine teaches us both through his Confessions and in his De Civitate Dei. But St. Augustine helps us to see also beyond the frailty of human memory to a crucial moral claim, and one that bears on what we're about this morning. In the absence of habits conducive to memory of one's own history, one cannot be a good human being, and one certainly cannot be a good Christian. There are plenty of reasons to think, as St. Augustine did on this matter, reasons that in the interest of time I will not offer here. In any case, assuming that he's right about this view, two implications follow for the task at hand. First, we must take with utmost seriousness the convictions and practices embodied in the educational institutions, historically near and far, that stand behind our own. And second, the modern university's failure to take its own heritage seriously will provide a clue about why things have gone wrong. Ultimately, the modern university's problem, I think, is akin to the one Boethius explores in his Consolation of Philosophy. Early in this great work, you will recall, Lady Philosophy diagnoses Boethius' troubles. "Now I know," she says, "the major cause of your illness. You have forgotten your true nature. It is because you are confused by loss of memory. You don't know the end and purpose of things, and you have forgotten the means by which the world is governed." Thus we regard the major cause of the modern university's illness. The university has forgotten its true nature, is confused by loss of memory, does not know the end and purpose of things, and has forgotten the means by which the world is governed. And so, as one way of approaching the task of restoring it to health, I want to begin by reminding us of the way we were, that is, of the way the university once was. Academicians long have regarded themselves as occupying a privileged position, if not with respect to material power, then at least with respect to the transformative power of ideas. Institutions of higher education have taught themselves and their constituencies to think in this way, and for good reason. Ideas matter, and associations of persons who think and act in light of their ideas have proven powerful forces, for good and for ill. But I want to make a more interesting claim, for merely to say that educative associations historically have shaped and transmitted ideas is platitudinous. More significantly, we must remember that in every historical epoch, until the present, formal educational bodies embraced morally transformative purposes as part and parcel to their interest in ideas. Moreover, they embraced moral formation essentially rather than accidentally, programmatically rather than incidentally, primarily rather than secondarily, and consistently rather than arbitrarily. Notre Dame Provost Nathan Hatch reminds us well of this when he writes, "The university in the West stands in a long tradition as a treasury of the good, the true, and the beautiful. From the medieval university to the modern liberal arts college, the academy has enjoyed privileged status as a place characterized by the search for truth, the development of moral character, and the passing on of what is prized as most worthy and noble. Yet many modern-day denizens of the university are variously oblivious, uninterested in, or even opposed to regarding education as morally laden. And where this proves untrue, where morally formative purposes are pursued within the university curriculum, it more often than not is accidental, arbitrary, haphazard, and secondary to the publicly acknowledged shared purposes of the university. Postmodernity, to be sure, has made advocacy fashionable in some quarters, but it in no way constitutes a substantive return to the past's morally coherent depictions of the good human life. How precisely have formal educational institutions historically construed the good human life, and in what ways have those conceptions substantively shaped their projects? At this point, the best I can do is point to a few representative examples from an admittedly large span of time, and I want to begin with education in classical antiquity. French philosopher Pierre Hadot ably reminds us of the morally transformative purposes and practices of classical education in a recently translated work, What is Ancient Philosophy? On Hadot's account, education in the context of 4th century Athens, above all else, constituted a way of life, one involving existential commitments within communities that engaged in spiritually edifying practices. We suppose philosophical dialogue, talk about ideas, to constitute the sine qua non of the academy, the lyceum, and the rest. But Hadot reminds us that while philosophical discussion was central, it never stood apart from the practice of morally and spiritually directed ways of life, unlike most contemporary pedagogy, conference talks, and journal articles, it would seem. We do ourselves a disservice, Hadot thinks, to forget that Plato and Aristotle were not primarily concerned with odd curiosities or mental gymnastics, but with a disciplined form of life that was committed to a particular conception of what is good. Of particular value is Hadot's reminder of the communitarian nature of philosophical education for the ancients. Athens' first educational institution shared alike dedication to, quote, a community of life and dialogue between masters and disciples within the framework of a school, end quote. The ancients rightly understood the psychagogically efficacious quality of communal life when organized around practices concomitant to the good they sought. Though perhaps some few learn to love wisdom on their own, most of us, it appears, require something like Aristotelian friendship to make much progress in intellectual or moral virtue. Hadot cites Seneca. The living word and life in common, he writes, will benefit you more than written discourse. It was not Epicurus' school that made great men of Metrodorus, Himmarchus, and Polyaenus, but his companionship. Not only did the ancient schools provide for shaping persons through life together, moral education was not simply left to the influence of association. All of the schools understood the indispensability of spiritually edifying exercises, both as propedeutic and consummatory, for the loving pursuit of wisdom. On Hadot's account, a range of spiritual exercises, ascesis, figured integrally into the curricular warp and woof of these schools. These practices were as varied as asceticism, fasting, sleeplessness, examination of consciousness, meditation on God, on death, and the like, philosophical discourse. Despite irreducible material differences, I want to underscore that many of the formal similarities between the ancient philosophical schools and properly Christian education should be acknowledged. With Christian convictions in view, education is and must be a way of life, one that involves a commitment of our whole selves to God, that receives God's grace through the community called the church, and that practices the intellectual, moral, and spiritual disciplines. In fact, if we turn to education in the patristic era, we find that it bears these similarities. The same efficacious methods of moral formation and the desirability of pursuing them were as important for the tradition of Christian education embodied in the first monasteries and cathedral schools as they were for the post-Socratic, Hellenistic, and Roman schools. Though many possible examples from this period are available, one familiar moment alone do I want to highlight from the period, one that reveals especially clearly the ways in which early Christianity adopted the form and means of education customary for the time. The historical moment I have in mind is St. Augustine's short-lived educational fraternity at Cassiciacum, at the villa of his friend Verecundus during the winter of 386. For this brief spell between his conversion and his baptism, Augustine retreated from public life, together with a company of friends, for the sake of learning the life of faith. Gary Wills explains the move by saying that while, quote, it was possible to be a Christian but not an ascetic, that did not fit late antique views of what was proper for a philosophical adherent to any serious moral program. And so, James O'Donnell relates, Augustine took along his family and friends. There they spent their day in philosophical and literary study and debate, and there Augustine says he often spent half the night awake in prayer and meditation. Though Augustine's fraternal Christian academy at Cassiciacum was informal and transitory, the winter establishment he made there is noteworthy for its appropriation of the methods of ancient education in the service of his conversion to Christianity. The Cassiciacum experience was marked by life together in a community, corporately engaged in realizing the good of wholehearted devotion to God, and to doing so through morally significant disciplines. The communitarian character of life with his friends figured crucially in the experience. In his soliloquies written during this period, Augustine writes of his desire that his friends live with him, quote, that together and concordantly we might inquire out God and our souls, for so, he writes, whichever first discover aught easily introduces his companions into it. And indeed, in the Confessions, Augustine reports that much of his writing at the time provides a record of discussions with my friends there present, so that Augustine attributes to his friends praise for abetting his own continuing pilgrimage to God. It was thus here, during these months, that he lived a life of leisure, devoted only with some chosen friends to the abstract contemplation of God. That it was a contemplation of God that constituted the good toward which this fraternal association tended provides another distinguishing feature to consider. That is, while the Cassiciacum Academy was assembled during the fall vintage vacation, the community gathered at Verecundus Villa shared a common purpose around which life was organized. Here we find no haphazard collection of individuals vacating responsibility for the sake of personal pleasure, entertainment, or amusement. Augustine had always enjoyed the company of friends. Indeed, of a much earlier group of friends, he wrote that all kinds of things rejoiced my soul in their company. But of that same earlier group of friends, he had afterwards lamented, wherever the soul of man turns, unless towards God, it cleaves to sorrow, for they go their way and are no more. At Cassiciacum, the polity was plainly ordered to the love of God. At Confessions, Book 9, Augustine comments about this time that the good I now sought was not in things outside me. In his soliloquies, he acknowledges the help of his friends, but he also unhesitatingly abjures any possible friendship which, by way of contrary purpose, might impede progress toward God. More clearly still, his short discourse of this period, De Beata Vita, ends by finding the source of the happy life in nothing other than the Holy Trinity. At Cassiciacum, we find then a community of friends committed to realizing a Christian conception of the good. They did so by embracing together a range of morally and spiritually edifying practices. Peter Brown comments in this regard, Augustine emerges as one of the many thinkers who have chosen to embrace their ideals as part of a program of moral education, and the first requisite for Augustine was discipline. The Fraternal Academy at Verecundas Villa prayed together and prayed privately. They meditatively read Scripture, with Augustine reporting in the Confessions his rapturous, heart-rending experience of reading the Psalms of David. They practiced private contemplation, withdrawing from books for the sake of time, with themselves, just thinking. And to be sure, they engaged in sophisticated theological dialogue, considering the immortality of the soul, the Trinity, and the order of the universe. The morally directed character of life at Cassiciacum was anything but accidental, incidental, secondary, or arbitrary. Education properly takes the form I have described, Augustine believed, because learning unavoidably must attend to moral formation and spiritual renewal. On his understanding of the human person, apprehending divine wisdom requires a right ordering of the soul, so that the educator must pursue moral as well as intellectual development. This is so because Augustine believes that we are not ruled by what we know, but by what we love. Loving the wrong things irremediably undermines our capacity for the truth, and thus teaching must cultivate our love for the right things, must take up the shaping of the will and the mind, must bind together moral and intellectual virtues so that one becomes well disposed to wisdom. Education for Augustine involves no pretense of neutrality. To the contrary, good education leaves no resources untapped in an unabashed, unqualified advocacy of truth, beauty, and goodness. Good education holds together the unity of truth for Augustine, moral and intellectual, and it holds together the unity of life as well. It is surely uncontroversial to see Augustine's little intellectual community as morally attuned. Latter-day critics might dismiss it, and those like it, for being so transparently committed to morally and spiritually transformative ends, but that it was so committed seems beyond dispute. What I suppose is striking is not that it differs from contemporary assumptions, but rather that contemporary assumptions about education differ from what was universally supposed, not only by Augustine and the early Christians, but by the whole of the pre-modern world. To turn to the medieval university just briefly, that to which Augustine aspired at Cassiciacum, the medieval monastic and cathedral schools by and large aspired to as well. But it was not until the 12th and largely 13th centuries that the medieval university arose, developing out of associations of independent scholarly guilds that began taking on students as their apprentices. At Paris, at Oxford, and Cambridge, the university was born. While it did not replicate without change the patterns of education that preceded it, one nonetheless sees in it continuities with the classical and patristic era education as a way of life, shared in community, through the privileging of morally efficacious disciplines, ordered to a particular conception of the good. In Oxford, for example, Balliol was organized from the beginning as a community of students living together under the direction of a master, to whom responsibility even to this day attaches for the government of the college as a place of religion and learning, for discipline and education, and for provision for daily chapel. Apprenticeship under the discipline of one's magister generally included shared residency, common meals, corporate worship, and study together, all of which were more or less directed toward a well-conceived understanding of the good life and preparation for admittance into the professional guilds of theology, law, or medicine. Remember in this connection none other than Chaucer's Oxford student, the one who preferred having 20 books in red and black of Aristotle's philosophy than costly clothes, fiddle, or psaltery. The student who, having no money, prayed earnestly for his friends, who supplied him books, returning thanks to them thus for paying for his learning. The people of whom Chaucer writes, "A tone of moral virtue filled his speech, and gladly would he learn and gladly teach." And on these matters Chaucer was far from alone. Aquinas and Dante, Erasmus, and Petrarch, the list goes on of those who through the modern era accepted the morally charged nature of education and embraced it as a means of individual and cultural formation, reform, and renewal. My aim, you'll recall, was to provide something of a historical context within which to understand the morally and spiritually formative role of Western education, to remember the morally formative purposes of education as once commonly and confidently practiced. I hope this albeit brief depiction of classical, patristic, and medieval education has reminded us of something important about the way we once were, as teachers, as students, and at least in nascent form as institutions. On our account, we, like Boethius, need to become reacquainted with what we once were, that we might be once again. As Christians, we must habitually remind ourselves of the morally laden nature of human life and learning. We must relate lucid narratives about our tradition. We must tend to the end and purpose of things, and we must faithfully, hopefully, and lovingly embrace God's good providence, those very things to which Lady Philosophy recalled Boethius. In order to do this fully, however, we need to ascertain precisely what has precipitated the departure of the modern university from its classical, patristic, and medieval forebears, and so I want to give way now to my colleague Michael Beaty for his presentation, After Vice, the Cultural and Intellectual Predicament of the Modern University. Thank you.
What you're receiving is not an outline of my remarks, but it is some material that I'm going to refer to at certain points in the paper, and I'll direct you at that time. Thank you very much, Doug. As he said, the title of my talk is After Vice, the Cultural and Intellectual Predicament of the Modern University. Obviously, that's a title in part stolen from Alistair McIntyre's book, After Virtue. And what I mean by this is that our contemporary culture, as McIntyre points out, encourages vice and not virtue by virtue of its intellectual commitments and various cultural conditions, and that this presents grave difficulties for a university which wishes to be faithful to its Christian convictions, by the way, which gave birth and shaped the modern university, or shaped the university, as Doug has already indicated. My introduction. In the past 2 decades, various scholars have called for colleges and universities to increase their attention to moral and civic education. Attention can be discerned in this call for recovery of moral and civic education. Some view the modern university as so morally perplexed about its purposes that it is too poorly equipped to recover the practices of moral education. Other scholars insist that despite that perplexity, it can be done even in the modern research university, and it must be done because to fail to do so will significantly impair our shared democratic culture. Clearly, local faculty support for these kinds of renewal proposals is vital to their success. Section 1, entitled The Marginalization of Morality. In the 19th century, American colleges and universities considered the moral and civic education of their students as 2 of its primary aims. Consider the following quotes from 19th century Baylor documents, and now you can look at page 1. I won't read all of them, but reading from the first one. One great object of the faculty will ever be to imbue the minds and hearts of young men with a sense of high honor, integrity, and moral excellence. While nothing denominational is taught, very special attention is paid to Bible recitation and to the Sabbath school instruction, and every student is required to attend public worship at such a place as his parent or guardian may designate. Now, this is from 1853. By the way, Baylor was founded in 1845, and when it was founded at Independence, it was founded where both men and women attended Baylor. but the catalogs are different. That's why you have the word men used here. And they were separate buildings across a creek. I think it was called the River Jordan. We won't go into that story. Reading from the 1880 catalog, the founders of the university designed it to be a true institution for the highest intellectual and moral training known to the passing age, and have planned to increase its advantages until it has become the peer of any existing American institution of learning. And then in the 1887 catalog, the faculty will constantly aim to imbue the mind and hearts of students with a deep sense of honor and moral excellence. As the Bible is the only foundation of morals and religion, its teachings will be often and solemnly enforced. By the way, by 1886, Baylor had moved from Independence to its present location in Waco, and it was both men and women were at the same institution, and there was no River Jordan separating them. Not surprisingly, given the clear intent to promote intellectual and moral formation among its students, at least as early as 1851, Baylor required of all of its students moral and mental philosophy, courses taught by whomever was the president of Baylor. Those of you who know the story of American higher education know that this is a familiar pattern for 19th century classical old-time colleges. These courses use familiar texts to anyone who studied these 19th century colleges. The ones used at Baylor were authored by Francis Whalen, one on moral science, one called mental philosophy, another one called political economy. And they were used at Baylor until 1896, 1897. They were used at Brown, they used at Harvard, they were used in Protestant college at least all over the country. In that academic year, 1896, 1897, all degree tracks still required courses in moral and mental philosophy, and also one called Evidences of Christianity. Indeed, in 1894, the Department of Moral and Mental Philosophy, Logic, and the Evidences of Christianity was established at Baylor. So we get a department established with that very long name, which really is signifying the main required courses. In 1897, this department becomes the Department of Philosophy, and in that year, all degree tracks still require 4 courses from the philosophy department: logic in the fall, and psychology in the spring of the student's junior year, and ethics in the fall, and apologetics in the spring of the senior year. The ethics course is not now being taught by Baylor's sitting president, but rather by a faculty member of the philosophy department. In this first case, a gentleman by the name of Mr. John Tanner, who had done graduate work at the University of Chicago. And here's the description of the required ethics course. And you see it next to the last quote. The course is intended to subserve both intellectual and moral ends by making and mastering an elaborate analysis of the subject. The student will be trained in the analytic method of study. A general survey will be made of the leading theories and schools of moralists. The principal aim, however, is to have the members of the class conscientiously and fearlessly grapple with the moral principles and issues of human life, and to construct, each for himself, his system of moral truth. One can see, I think, that a fundamental change in the understanding of the nature and aims of moral philosophy or ethics has now taken place in Baylor in just about a decade. Why? That is, what intellectual and cultural changes prompted this changed conception of the nature and function of moral philosophy or ethics at Baylor? This is a difficult question to answer about Baylor in particular. But we do know enough about the general cultural and intellectual changes in the larger culture that leads to the abandonment of moral education as a primary task of the university, a task 19th century American colleges accepted as a defining feature of their existence. There are a number of places to gain access to these changes, and one is a recent book called The Making of the Modern University, Intellectual Transformation and the Marginalization of Morality, written by Julie Rubin and published in 1996. She contends that by the mid-20th century, the American research universities divorced questions of morality from the intellectual life of the university. David Reisman and Christopher Jinks published a book in 1968 called The Academic Revolution, and in it and in other works, they claim that the modern research university sets the agenda for all other colleges and universities. So whatever's going on there is going to be mimicked to some extent or the other in comprehensive universities or colleges. So if the research universities are leaving behind moral education and leaving it to the extracurricular, for example, so you will find that same sort of tendency or disposition in comprehensive universities and colleges as well. Now, one of the things that you'll note is while that's going on, says Rubin, in the catalogs still continue to make reference to the fact that the institution takes seriously moral and civic education. Look at the last quote on that first page. From beginning in 1995 up to the present day, you can find this in Baylor's catalog. Baylor strives to develop responsible citizens. Baylor provides expanded opportunities for civic education and for the church and community service at home and abroad. Beyond the intellectual life, the university pursues the social, physical, ethical, and spiritual development of each student. But what do Baylor faculty actually think about moral education as a university aim or purpose? And now I want you to go to the second page of the handout that I've given you. In a faculty survey done in the fall of 1994, a survey that was also replicated in 1995 at Notre Dame, in 1996 at Boston College, and 1997 at Brigham Young University. 51% of Baylor faculty answered that a maximum possible emphasis should be given to the goal of encouraging the student's moral development. So look at that top part of your handout. Faculty could answer maximum possible emphasis, emphasis, minimum possible emphasis, no emphasis. And what you see there is, reading the top, advancing knowledge through undergraduate teaching. Baylor faculty say we want to give that nearly 91%, maximum possible emphasis. And this is shared by the faculty at the other institutions. Go down to the next one, advancing knowledge through research. Notice that the Baylor faculty in 95, only 36.6% said this should be given maximum possible emphasis. That would be a changed situation in 2002. But compare that to Notre Dame, nearly 76%. Boston College, 59%. Brigham Young and Baylor, less. Indicating, I think, that they're more committed to undergraduate education at that point in their history. But now look at encouraging the student's moral development. 52% Baylor. Notice, now here's my point. A faculty member in the 19th century would find that distance puzzling. As Doug is trying to make the point, undergraduate education can't be done without being committed to moral education. So if you're going to give maximum possible emphasis to moral education, to undergraduate education, you should answer moral education in the same way. So we've already got a tension indicated there. Now, Baylor faculty they're not different from faculty at other comprehensive and research universities. In national surveys of American faculty done in 89, 94, and 98, we get faculty at about the same maximum possible emphasis at 56 to 57%. So Baylor is not unusual. It's typical in that way. Now, when asked a more particular question, and that's where we get this sort of second, percentage of faculty strongly agreeing or disagreeing or strongly disagreeing. So those are the four possibilities. SA, strongly agreeing, A, agreeing, D, disagreeing, SD, strongly disagreeing. To meet its academic and faith-related goals, Baylor should require courses designed to help students think more critically about their moral commitments. Everybody with me? You following me? Okay, the first percentages are combining agree and strongly agree. Okay? So 73.8% are saying we agree to strongly agree. The second one, though, is strongly agree. You following me? Earlier we said we're committed to moral development at about 50%, but if you require it, only 27% of us are willing to say we strongly agree with that. Now, notice if you add to that, live more virtuous lives. Not only help students think critically about the moral issues they confront, but also to live more morally virtuous lives, which I think is the language of the 19th century. That what we're trying to do is not just get you to think, but also to live morally well-shaped, well-grounded life. Notice what happens. From 73.8% at Baylor, it goes down to 51.2 agree to strongly agree. You following me? And from 27.8 strongly agree, it goes down to 16.4 at Baylor. But you see the same sort of pattern at Notre Dame and Boston College. The only difference is at Brigham Young. Notice that you get 73% think critically. It goes up to 77.9 if you throw in the moral virtue part. And the strongly agree is even more interesting. Approximately 24% strongly agree. It goes up to 40.3 if you throw in moral formation. I won't have anything else to say about Brigham Young except that that's a very, very interesting finding. Well, when we, so those are some statistics. Now go on to the next page. When Baylor faculty, as well as others, were encouraged to comment on these questions, so we had the part you can check the boxes, but then we allowed you to comment. My sociologist friend Larry Lyon told me that most faculty wouldn't comment on these questions. Not so. At every institution, they had comments that the sociologists call the qualitative part of the survey. Here's some representative responses. These are taken just from Baylor, but I can tell you for all of these categories, they're comparable at all the institutions, less so at Brigham Young. So the most commonly shared are among Boston College, Baylor, and Notre Dame. Moral education is not an academic subject. That's the first. Students can't learn it in a classroom. I doubt that you can put together an academic course. I don't even believe it's appropriate. Courses in moral education or philosophy should be electives and not required. I support the availability of a course, so there you presume it can be taught, but I'm not sure it should be required. Or, next, you can't define virtue. With reservation, I'd say you could require this kind of course, but who's to say what virtue is? Or it depends on how it's defined. Or who's to be the judge of it? Or whose idea? What is the Baylor definition of virtue, pray tell? I have a couple of people in mind who might have said that. Virtue must be chosen and not coerced or forced. How can anyone legislate someone else's experience? Virtuous is a judgment call. This smells of theocracy. We are not indoctrinating or legislating. Anything beyond voluntary attendance at a public homily constitutes an invasion of personal privacy on this topic, and it is not in the Baptist tradition. You can't force morals. In summary, faculty at Baylor, Notre Dame, and Boston College share common concerns about the traditional task of moral education or moral formation as understood in the university until the advent of the modern university. Let me summarize. We cannot agree upon or define virtue or the morally good person or the morally virtuous life, etc. Second, virtue and morally appropriate behavior must be chosen and not forced. And finally, I'm not even sure it can really be taught in an academic setting. Given these reservations by faculty, it's not surprising that Professor Rubin entitled her manuscript, The Making of the Modern University, Intellectual Transformation and the Marginalization of Morality. In the final section of this paper, let me suggest 6 cultural or intellectual developments which prompts this marginalization in the 20th century. First, the rise of the modern university led to an increased emphasis on academic specialization and the importance of professors as specialized experts. With the stress on specialization came the fragmentation of academic culture into disciplines and the evolution of the curriculum into discipline, professionally based majors and undergraduate programs. The increasing specialization of academic disciplines disconnected moral concerns from most disciplines. For example, Douglas Sloan contends that one of the primary problems that led to the demise of the senior capstone moral philosophy course offered at most every college in the 19th century was that it assumed a unity to the curriculum that could not be sustained in light of the increasing fragmentation of knowledge in academic disciplines. More deeply rooted than that is the Christian notion of unity and truth, and that knowledge possesses a unity and that every curriculum should mirror that unity. Second, the new modern university identified science, its practices, and its results with knowledge. Since the faculty at research universities generated new knowledge by virtue of their specialized scientific expertise, they were vested with cultural authority. And this was because they used objective methods of science to establish their claims. Once objectivity became associated with both a fact-value distinction and value-neutral inquiry, it became difficult for faculty to resist the notion that moral and civic education are subjective endeavors based on the private preferences or biases of faculty and ought, therefore, to have little place in the university curriculum. Rubin observes that, and I quote, "The separation of fact-value became both a powerful and problematic concept in 20th century intellectual life. It has often been evoked as a normative guide for scholars. Its normative status is reinforced by the structure of modern higher education, which makes the separation of morality and knowledge seem a natural part of the intellectual life." She concludes that the overall result for universities have been a deep ambivalence about the separation of knowledge and morality. One need only cite, say, Richard Rorty in a number of his works, who says there's no such thing as moral knowledge, there's only moral beliefs or moral preferences. Third, in this new environment of academic specialization, few professors had training in moral philosophy or theology. And we might add, we, the three of us, you can take issue with us, the larger intellectual conversations within which both these kinds of inquiries make sense. The narrow disciplinary focus of most faculty meant that few faculty believed themselves to have the academic expertise to contribute to the project of moral education, and thus it would be unprofessional to address moral concerns in their classes. Fourth, during the 20th century, America underwent profound social changes. America's expanding religious and philosophical disagreements destroyed the more or less dominant and homogeneous culture that supported the moral consensus reflected in the old-time or classical college, in its expectations of faculty members and students, in its curriculum, in its textbooks, and in its campus environment. Lost was any semblance of a shared conception of the good, or if there was any such shared conception of the good was the individual who maximizes his or her choices, and hence morality becomes simply about choice or about freedom. Finally, neither the practices of science and its cultural authority nor any various versions of reason were sufficient to help the modern Western democracies find a common moral understanding of virtue and character, says Rubin. Now, our claim is that these 6 and others as well are but symptoms of the larger intellectual crisis told so well by Alistair McIntyre in his classic After Virtue. It is the loss of a coherent intellectual tradition within which the intellectual and moral capacities are understood to be integrally related and ultimately ideally unified within a single life. That such an intellectual tradition is no longer a significant and active part of our cultural memory, even in the Christian university, means that faculty can hardly be expected to imagine how moral education about the virtues might be not only an academic discipline, but also a set of formative practices, even within the research university. And the failure to imagine such possibilities is in no small measure a function of the loss of a common moral vocabulary, sufficiently rich to provide prospects for not only agreements, but interesting disagreements as well. The reduction of our common moral vocabulary to only or primarily matters of individual choice or freedom condemns moral education to the extracurricular domain of the university, one's own private and subjective sphere, and whatever contractual relationships one might voluntarily assume. Our way out is by way of remembering, retrieving, and reviving a tradition of Christian moral reflection, and programmatic efforts to elicit interesting conversations on our campuses and our communities about the good, and ultimately fostering such efforts that would give us enriched imaginations, especially enriched moral imaginations. But Dr. Moore will tell us more about how these kinds of practices, what kinds of practices are necessary to achieve these goals. Dr. Moore.
Thanks, Mike. Doug. I had decided that if we had less than 25 people, we should all go hear McIntyre and Baxter on McGreevy. But it looks like we'll finish with this project. My job is to talk about a range of practices and ideas that might help surmount and overcome the predicament of our shared moral fragmentation and generate ways of formation and renewal. Obviously, this is a task that affects all of us who are involved in universities, which is most of us in this room and most of us who come to conferences like this. There is no algorithm, there's no simple solution to the very difficult task that we have ahead. I do want to talk about a couple of strategies, ways in which we might think about some of these things, and hopefully leave plenty of time for some conversation. I've got a manuscript here, but I'm going to just sort of talk through some of the main points so that we have some time for questions and conversations. In the Catholic world, it is less the case, but in the world of evangelical Protestant universities, one way of overcoming this dilemma that's been presented is through the language of worldview construction. You hear a great deal of talk at Protestant evangelical colleges and among Christian scholars about cultivating a Christian worldview. Our university uses this in its promotional material. I myself, in print, have talked about the importance of developing a Christian worldview and thinking Christianly. And I don't want to back off of that. I think that's an important category and it's an important way of going. But it is absolutely the case that the notion of developing a Christian worldview will not solve the problem articulated by Mike Beaty, and it will not allow us to retrieve or emulate or reconstruct anything remotely resembling the kinds of patterns that Doug Henry was talking about. The title of my paper is Beyond Worldviews, Praxis, Formation, and Renewal, which I was informed by a colleague could be a title that could cover virtually any topic anywhere. And that's probably the case. But I want to think about this notion of the role of praxis in our worldviews. The role that is a deeply Aristotelian and Thomistic notion that if we're going to think about thinking Christianly, we have to recognize that there must be unity of the intellectual and the moral virtues. There must be ways of understanding courage, charity, fidelity, generosity, we recognize that these aren't concepts to be taught or merely ways of thinking, but we have to get our hands dirty. We have to get our hands dirty in ways that allow us to form these communities, to form lives, to develop habits of mind and of thought and ways of being in the world. Praxis has Marxist connotations. I think it is one of the delicious ironies of history that we can appropriate these sorts of concepts in the ways that we might choose to do so at the beginning of a new century. Praxis is also one of these terms that is used so often and in so many cases that it is almost devoid of meaning. But I want to take that phrase from the second of Marx's theses on Feuerbach, in which he talks about the necessity of proving the truth. We all remember the final phrase, the final of these 12 theses, that philosophers have only interpreted the world. The point, however, is to change it. And for Marx, this had narrow materialist manifestations. It was predicated on a division between what he called real sensuous activity and the object of contemplation. Christian universities today stand at a place where we reject this distinction between the real sensuous activity and the object of contemplation. And yet we want still to prove the truth. And we are not content merely with interpreting the world. We want to change it. But we don't want to change the world in some ways that is often... We have grander goals and grander dreams than merely creating good thinkers, critical thinkers, and good citizens. The equivocal orientation of so many of our campus mission statements. Strategies for renewal. I want to talk about ways that allow us to do three things: memory, conversation, and imagination. Memory, conversation, and imagination are not simply tied to the past, the present, and the future, but there is a necessary correlation. It is also the case that memory, conversation, and imagination help us bridge the gap between the active life and the contemplative life. We need strategies and practices for enabling us to cultivate memory, conversation, and imagination that will bridge the gap between real sensuous activity and the object of contemplation. I want to talk about two, and I don't have time to talk about one, let alone two of these. But the two strategies that I want to talk about that I think Christian colleges and universities need to explore, investigate, and invest in. And by investing, I mean both our energy and our financial resources, but also our personnel resources. We need sustained, engaged practices. We need a sustained, engaged curricular endeavor which will take us back to the reading of those great texts within a Christian framework. And we need a sustained practice of hospitality that is integrated throughout both the curricular and extracurricular activities. Great texts. What to say about this in 3 or 4 minutes? Well, we recognize immediately that engaging those master works of creative and intellectual composition, we are engaged in a project that is about the cultivation of memory. We are learning and engaging our students in a task of retrieval, that they might know exactly what those matters that matter are, that they might have an awareness of what the conversation has been about what the goods of human existence are, what in fact it means to flourish as human beings. And we know that the cultivation of memory along those lines is intimately connected with their capacity to have meaningful conversation. Meaningful conversation is all too infrequent on our college campuses today. I don't know about your campus culture. Obviously, we come from a variety of schools with a variety of problems and a variety of different resources, but on our college campus, student culture is dominated by fraternities and sororities. And part of the task of Christian educators is to take the culture back. To take the culture back in a way that there's a significant conversation about what the goods of human existence are. What does it mean to be happy? We've got kids who are ripe for seeing the distinction between Aristotle's different kinds of friendship. They know all about friendships based on pleasure. They've got a few friendships based on utility. Many of them have far too few friendships based on a common conception of the good. Helping kids to read these texts and to have these kinds of conversations allows us also to disabuse them and ourselves of many of the cliches of modern education. We're not here to teach you what to think. We're just here to teach you how to think. Only in a world that is completely devoid of teleology can we say things like this with a straight face. We just want you to think for yourselves. Most of our 19-year-olds are incapable of distinguishing think for themselves with thinking by themselves. The way that I present it in my classes is that I desperately want them to take responsibility for their beliefs, but I am not remotely interested in them thinking for themselves. I want them to think with St. Augustine. I want them to think with Dante. I want them to think with Flannery O'Connor. Augustine is, as all of you in this room know, a figure with whom, when students are exposed to Augustine, they can relate to him. Here is someone that lived a raucous youth. The technical term, of course, is hellraiser. Fathered a child out of wedlock, refused to marry the child's mother because it would make his professional aspirations difficult. One who understood quite clearly that his heart was restless until it rests in thee. Our kids need to think with St. Augustine. It's an act of memory, conversation, and imagination. Our kids need to think with Dante. I'm on a Protestant campus in which the very idea of purgatory for lots of our kids is a stretch. They're not quite sure what to make of it. And yet, when they read this greatest of all Christian poems and come to see that there is not so great a difference between some of the ordeals that the souls in purgatory and the souls in hell are going through, only the difference being that the souls in purgatory are on their way to somewhere. They're moving. They're making progress. And they're resting. Resting at night and resuming their tasks the next day. It transforms the world of an experience, and some of our students are living in hells that, though it was not so many years ago, many of us have a very difficult time imagining. I'm regularly floored by the things that my students tell me about the trials they are undergoing. Helping them move, as it were, from hell to purgatory is an act of memory, conversation, and imagination. Reading great texts will not solve their problems, but it will give them some resources. Resources within a conversation, a context, a way of helping them recognize that it really is true that there's nothing new under the sun, and that the problems and the tasks that they have are not so different from those who have gone before. I want them also to think with Flannery O'Connor. I want them to read short stories like A Good Man is Hard to Find, and I want them to see themselves in that grandmother who on the side of the road, when the family has been assaulted by the misfit, screams, "Jesus, save me! Jesus, save me!" And the misfit pronounces one of the most powerful lines in American literature. She'd have been a good woman if there'd been somebody there to shoot her every minute of her life. It's not about thinking for yourself. It's about thinking with those who have gone before, and thinking with their colleagues, and thinking with their faculty members. We need to disabuse them of the cliches of modern education. Disabuse them of the notion that in the final analysis there are things that we'll just have to agree to disagree about. I tell them over and over again, in our class we will not agree to disagree. We're just going to keep on disagreeing. When we finally say that we're going to agree to disagree, it means there's nothing else that you can say to me that will change my mind. There's nothing else that I can say to you that will change your mind, and we might as well quit talking. And if we've quit talking, we've quit being friends. We're going to keep on disagreeing and hope we don't kill each other in the process. Memory, conversation, imagination. Memory, conversation, and imagination are also exemplified in hospitality. Hospitality, I've got to quit here because we only have a few minutes as it is. But hospitality is a practice that can become a comprehensive orientation for the Christian college and university. If Christian colleges and universities think that tolerance is the comprehensive practice, then the game is over. We must create worlds in which we can receive the stranger. We must create worlds in which we can receive the child. Receive the alien. This applies most obviously to our students that come from so many different places, that come to live with us. It applies for curricular matters. It applies to the books that we read and the courses that we teach and the ideas that we engage. Charitably receiving the alien. Learning from this one that is different. Sometimes different in ways that challenge us to the very core of our being. And yet we don't encounter this stranger in some kind of neutral objective space, primarily because there's no such thing as neutral objective space. We encounter them in a place and with habits of mind and thought and being. Hospitality applies to how we encounter students. It applies to our curricular endeavors. It also applies to how we treat our colleagues and how we think about the institutional obligations of the university. Universities the world over are now outsourcing all of those tasks that are essential but unimportant. At our university, there are virtually no service industries that are staffed by Baylor employees, whether it's food service or maintenance or grounds teams or the Xerox people. At one time, all of these people were university employees and had the benefit of full tuition for their children. Christian colleges as a place of hospitality, as places for formation and renewal, will have to do some expensive work, but it will be work that will show this college as a place that is genuinely different, a place where a certain conversation about the past and the future is kept alive. I don't have time to read the conclusion, but I want to read just a brief portion here. In Alistair McIntyre's very important recent book from 3 or 4 years ago, Dependent Rational Animals, McIntyre makes a very important argument about what he calls the virtues of acknowledged dependence. And the virtues of acknowledged dependence open up for us hospitality and the engagement with great texts in some profound and interesting ways. McIntyre is particularly concerned with misericordia. McIntyre rejects the traditional definition of misericordia as pity because he wants to avoid connotations of condescension and emphasize that misericordia, as St. Thomas understood it, is informed by appropriate rational judgment. McIntyre asserts emphatically that this appropriate rational judgment is not a capacity for sentiment. According to McIntyre, quote, sentiment unguided by reason becomes sentimentality, and sentimentality is a sign of moral failure. And hospitality, the messy, thankless, expensive endeavor that it is, will have no truck with sentimentality. Hospitality instantiates misericordia. It's no accident that Richard Rorty has turned towards sentimentality as a source for understanding our larger connection to human society and what he calls patterns of meaningfulness. Rorty has claimed, quote, that America and democracy are shorthand for a new conception of what it is to be human, a conception that has no room for obedience to non-human authority, unquote. In a world where most citizens think of their primary responsibility, and you can see this in the quotations that Mike presented, that our primary responsibility is the creation of good citizens, Christian universities become radical countercultural proposals. Hospitality in such a place also becomes a shorthand for what it means to be human. The chief difference, of course, is that for Christians, what it means to be human is to be created imago Dei, and to exercise hospitality is to emulate divine action. Hospitality enjoins us, as my friend Bill Portier likes to say, to be less spiritual and more incarnational. Hospitality is incarnational. Rorty confesses that he, like Whitman and Dewey, wants utopian America, quote, wants utopian America to replace God as the unconditional object of desire, unquote. He says, quote, it's not about blending the worship of an eternal being with hope for the temporal realization in America of this being's will. It's a matter, and this is a quote from Rorty, of forgetting about eternity, unquote. Hospitality never lets us forget about eternity. The persistent and sustained reading of great texts never let us forget about eternity, and thus never let us forget and enable us to think about the past, the present, and the future. Through memory, conversation, and imagination, these strategies remind us of the eternal perspective from which to view human nature. It might seem otherwise. Great text sounds like a curriculum proposal. Hospitality is self-sacrificial service in the here and now, serving strangers and meeting needs. However, because these Christian strategies are motivated by divine solidarity, we are animated by the recognition that our task is that of treating others in the way God has treated us, sustained by the knowledge that it is God who is at work in us. And because of all of these things, we can never forget about eternity. The vision of worldview that I have articulated here is a difficult one, and we do not know, cannot know finally what it will take for the Christian university to be a place of formation and renewal. But it is clear, I think, that whatever worldview we are able to articulate, it must contain within it these broadly Aristotelian and Thomistic components which help us recognize that the life well lived is not merely about thinking in a certain way or in a certain framework, but it is a flourishing human life, a life characterized by the unity of the virtues in service and pursuit of the unity of truth. It's a vision of worldview which recognizes that our capacity to think Christianly is intimately connected with worship, sacrifice, the rearing of children, and the welcoming of guests. We learn to think Christianly through laughter and tears, through the ridiculous and the sublime. It is, as Walker Percy describes at the conclusion of The Moviegoer, not only part and parcel of the complex business of coming up in the world, nor merely that we believe that God himself is present at the corner of Elysian Fields and Bons Enfants, or we might say on the second floor of the CCE or in the Morris Inn, but rather we can see that it just might be both. Percy says, through some dim, dazzling trick of grace, coming for the one and receiving the other as God's own importunate bonus. With Percy, we can acknowledge it is impossible to say. Thank you.
I'd like to thank all of the panelists for their individual contributions and the sense of the whole they provided. I think it's a reminder of why all of us should be particularly attentive to the movements of renewal like Baylor at this point in Christian higher education. We're really at about the end of our time, but I think if we could have one or two questions.
That was wonderful. Thank you. With you all, I would surely want to identify as sham the liberal, political, moral, epistemological claims to neutrality, and to insist on the importance of community and praxis for Christian education. But with Lonergan and a few realist phenomenologists who want to retrieve Thomas, I would want to mark out an invariant set of intentional operations directed to the transcendentals, thus constitutive of a basic being, a man relation on whose field the distinction between subject and object occurs. The nice thing about that is that when you go on to acknowledge the thickly encumbered and situated character of the subject, as one should in a communitarian fashion, you don't have to proceed to worry about relativism. I don't expect you folks to follow Lonergan or Edith Stein, but may I ask if you have any thoughts on the epistemic difficulties that come up with communitarianism? Or whether that isn't on Crawford, but perhaps a kind of metaphysics.
Well, I mean, I'll go first, and there's no brief way to answer this question. My own perspective would be that the question of relativism is always a persistent, nagging problem. It's one that we can never put to bed, as it were. I would prefer, in thinking about this, to take my lights from people like Jim McClendon, important Baptist theologian who died a few years ago, who wanted to articulate and think about this problem not in terms of our capacity to open up the transcendent in a way that might be accessible to all, but rather to talk about what Jim called the tournament of narratives that we find ourselves in, without ever giving in to the notion that there is in fact a relativism, but recognizing that there is a real contest to tell the story, the true story of how the world goes. And there is truth. But it comes in the form of this contested character about the good that we find ourselves in. And this tournament of narratives is one in which we will have to have some unfortunate allies, as it were, but always with the recognition that that we can never give up on the truth. But we certainly may not be able to count on, well, scientific conceptions of objectivity that might ultimately be open to all the smart people in the room. Thank you.
Jorge?
This was very stimulating, very helpful. One, I hope, constructive suggestion as a way perhaps to talk to some of those on the other side. There is an acknowledgement of the importance of academic integrity, and indeed is a growing problem, I think, in the computer age on campuses. And also, I think as Dr. Moore mentioned, there's an emphasis sometimes on reconceiving the point of education as teaching people how to think rather than what to think. But there is interesting work going on in philosophy that could help bring, taking those as starting points to help bring them around. Some of the work on teaching people how to think is basically teaching them what's good reasoning. And increasingly in epistemology, good reasoning is understood in terms of reasoning that's characterized by various intellectual virtues, thinking in such a way that reflects patience, perseverance, honesty, but also fairness to others, due acknowledgement of them, a kind of courage, sort of humility, rather than sticking to one's own views simply because of pridefulness that they're one's own. And then increasingly some work is being done to suggest that intellectual virtues themselves need to be really understood as moral virtues, that the kind of patience, perseverance, humility, justice that we're talking about in the intellectual realm isn't really that far removed from that we talk about in the moral realm. So it's a way of perhaps beginning in the starting point that other people suggest. And similarly, we'll talk about integrity. Integrity obviously suggests something about the integration of the self and the place of reasoning and the life of the self. And that's a way, again, of leading it into a discussion of more traditional themes and ethics about how we are meant to live and how we can.
Thank you.
Can I follow up on that just for a moment?
Sure.
That's very interesting. It just brought up another point I wanted to make, which is that the Carnegie Institute, actually in scholarship assessed with classic building up lawyers' work, talks about the moral qualities of a scholar and names the main three: integrity, perseverance, and courage as being essential moral qualities for any scholar. Which really brings me to my other point, where we see institutions like AAC&U, AAG having major programs such as civic engagement, the Democracy Project, Character Formation Project. We see these things all coming out of the public sphere and not out of the Christian sphere, and being much more acceptable, almost, where we find Americans willing to agree that there are certain things we do all consider to be virtues. And I would just like to bring up that I think what was missing to me from your history was the fact that we've moved from an age where we only educated the elite and the male elite to an age of information where we do believe we need to educate all citizens. And I think that Christianity has to own up to some of its baggage on this, which is automatically there, even as I look at all the white males talking, that it hasn't been friendly to women, and Christianity, as well as Islam and the other major Christian organizations, have been used as part of truth to say women had no access to this realm. And until it faces that, I think there's a normal hostility. When you look at the American college population right now being predominantly female, I think Christianity and Christian universities, and I'm at a Catholic university, I'm a huge proponent of all of this and have done great fights with my faculty over what's required and not required, but I do think we have to be honest and sincere and really acknowledge some of these things if we're going to move forward. Otherwise, I think the publics are going to leave us in the dust, and frankly, as a Christian, I find that rather embarrassing. Thank you.
I would just say that we have a record that is not very admirable in all kinds of areas, and we absolutely have to own up to those places where we've been discriminatory and where we have failed to live up to our own standards and our own our own commitment to a hospitality which receives the stranger and the alien. So I don't deny any of that, and I think we have a long way to go. The question of the publics is a little bit more complicated, but thank you.
All right, just one last question.
Moore. I have a question for Professor Moore. I wanted to ask if you saw the necessity for any kind of active component.
I'm sorry, Sarah, I can't.
Do you see the necessity for any kind of active component to go along with the Great Text program, if nothing else to encourage and cultivate this virtue of misericordia or hospitality or something? So you mentioned memory, conversation, and imagination, but it seems that imagination is directly tied to experience, and I'm wondering how you want to cultivate hospitality among the student body.
There's a whole section here about service learning that I skipped, well, not intentionally, just talking through it and whatnot. I think one of the difficulties is that lots of, as universities have recognized the great insights that come from service learning, sometimes what we've done is create programs and put directors over it and mandated that kids have X number of hours and whatnot, and the service learning is often divorced from an integrated way of thinking about what our courses present and ways in which we can present those sorts of opportunities and those challenges. I think that's a terribly important way of going at it. In skipping that, it was not intentional, but just going over. But there are lots of strategies here. I mean, the very capacity of imagination is to not be constrained in the ways that we have been by the patterns. And this certainly comes to the question that you've raised here.
Let me thank the panelists one more time. Thanks very much.